For the time being, we've been animating only objects. And we have seen that each time we try to animate a new object, a new animation or a new action data is created. And when it comes to animating an object, we are currently only animating a point, its origin point. But what if we want to animate a more complex object or a character? Will we have to create an action for each finger? How do you bend an arm if it's not a separated object? There is one tool that allows us to do this, and you've probably already heard about it. It's a rig or an armature. So if you think of a humanoid character rig, it's generally a skeleton with a bunch of constraints and mechanisms that allow the animator to manipulate the character in an intuitive fashion. And you can rig absolutely anything. Here is a new version of our bouncing ball. So there is a new object in my scene. I can find my ball object, but I also can find this ball armature object. And as an object, it has transform channels. And as any other object, it's a container with specific data. We can find armature data and bone data. Also, as a specific object, it has specific mode. An edition mode that allows to build the armature and that is used by riggers, so you won't need to enter edit mode at any time. And a pose mode, that is the mode that will allow us to manipulate the armature and animate whatever character or object that is bound to this armature. We can change mode from object to pose by pressing Ctrl Tab. So let's have a closer look to this rig or armature. When in pose mode, you can select whatever controller you want. Those are called bones, and you can consider them as being sub-object of the armature. It means that each bone will have its own transform channels. And each bone have a specific behavior or a specific task that has been created by the rigger. On our bone, the main controller is called the root and allow us to move the entire ball. Moving the green controllers allow us to use squash and stretch. The yellow controller allows us to rotate the ball. So instead of transforming the ball directly, here we are using those controllers to create those transformations. And it will allow us to create way more complex transformation onto a character than animating simple objects. Because the armature can deform the object that is bound to it. The armature is actually a simple modifier that deforms our object. So a versatile armature or rig will allow you to give the pose you want for your character. And the good rig will give you the maximum of posing possibilities with intuitive fashion. So before we start animating the squirrel character, I will give you some good practice when it comes to animating using an armature. With my ball rigged file open, I will enable the auto keying and I will switch to pose mode by pressing Ctrl Tab. As soon as I transform one of the controller by selecting it, pressing G, S or R, as I will do for any object, I can see that my auto keying is recording what I'm doing. And Blender is creating a keyframe for the transform channels of the controllers. The first awesome thing is that if I switch to the dope sheet in the action editor and switch to see all the keyed channel, I can see that all the different manipulator animation are stored into a single action. Because the action is associated to the armature object, and we can consider each manipulator as being a sub-object that can be animated. And as for any object, I can see that each of the manipulator has their location, rotation, and scale keyed. But each of those controllers has a specific task. For example, this rotation controller, if I try to move it or scale it, I can't. And when I try to rotate it, it only rotates around its x-axis. So instead of having a keyframe for every transform channel, that would be better if I add only a keyframe on its X rotation, since I won't be using any other of its transform channel. So I've selected all the transform channel I don't want, and I will simply press X to get rid of them. Now I will go a little further in time and I will try to rotate the ball. As soon as I rotate the rotation controller, I can see the auto keying is on and the X value being orange, meaning that it's being transformed but not recorded. But as soon as I release the transform, Blender writes again a keyframe on all the transform channels. And I can go ahead for a long time like that, removing the keyframe I don't want, and whenever I try to transform this manipulator, Blender writes a keyframe on everything. So to get rid of this issue, we need to create what we call a keying set. To access the keying option, we need to go into the timeline. So the first thing I do is renaming the action and call it 00 so that it will be first in the alphabetic order, keying set ball. Now I will check each controller, and for each transform channel that is locked, I will get rid of the corresponding keyframe, because these are the only keys that will really serve the animation of the ball. In the end, I only have 14 keyframes remaining instead of the 36 initial I had. So my action editor and my graph editor will sure be way cleaner. I now need to open the timeline, so I will drag a new editor and switch to the timeline. In the timeline header, I will go to the keying set, and in the active keying, I can see that I have a lot of different options. So I will choose rotation and I will try rotating my manipulator. Then Blender is still recording all the keyframes. And this is because we need to tell Blender to use this keying set by clicking the arrow near the auto recording button and choose only active keying set. Now when I try transforming my manipulator, all the rotation channel will be keyframed. So we are getting close. I will get rid of the unwanted keyframe. And if we go back into the keying set, we can see that there is a lot of options, and the one that is interesting for us is available. From there, Blender will only auto-record the keyframe that has already been written, meaning that the channel where we have inserted a keyframe prior to use this keying set. If you haven't set a first keyframe before applying the keying set, then the auto keying won't write any keyframe. And if I try inserting a keyframe pressing I will get this error message. Basically, I can't write a keyframe with the actual setup. To fix that, we only need to insert a keyframe directly into the transform channel panel. Then I can get rid of the two channels I don't want, the Y and Z channel. There is another way to set the auto keying on available by default. It's by going into the preferences, animation, only insert available. It's really a matter of personal preferences. I personally use the keying filter. Please note that I'm using Blender 2.92 alpha, so the position of the different options might change. Alright, now you are ready to animate using an armature. We have seen that we can use an armature to perform more complex transformation, that an armature can deform the object that is bound to it, that the armature object is made of sub-objects called bone. Each of those controller bones can be keyed, but Blender will create a single action that will hold all the different keys of all the controllers of a single armature. It is highly recommended to create a keying set to keep your daub sheet and graph editor as clean as possible.